If you've been looking for something quiet to settle your thoughts tonight, you've found it. Let the day fade for a moment. We're going to spend time in a place where winter was not a season, but a siege, where cold arrived in October and remained until April, where darkness stretched across the land for months, and survival depended on walls made of earth, fires that could not die, and the warmth of bodies pressed close together in a single room. This is about sleep in the Viking Age, not the drama of raids or ships, not battle or exploration, just the ordinary problem of closing your eyes and making it through a frozen night when there was no central heating, no insulated walls, no separate bedrooms, just a turf longhouse, a dying fire, and a family arranging themselves on wooden platforms under layers of wool and fur. We'll move slowly through the landscape of the architecture and the small practical methods that made rest possible when temperatures dropped far below freezing and wind swept across the North Atlantic darkness. There's no urgency here. Let yourself settle. We have time to look closely at how people built warmth from almost nothing, how they structured their nights around fire and shared heat, and how sleep itself became a collective act of survival. The story begins outside, in the cold. Winter in Scandinavia during the Viking Age was measured not in weeks but in months of darkness and cold that transformed the entire rhythm of life. By late October, the light began its retreat. Days shortened rapidly. In southern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the winter solstice brought roughly 6 hours of dim daylight, pale, low on the horizon. The sun never climbed high enough to offer real warmth. Further north, the darkness was absolute. In the Lofoten Islands, in the settlements above the Arctic Circle, the sun disappeared entirely for weeks. Polar night. The sky might brighten to a deep blue twilight at midday, but true sunrise would not return until late January. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. The sea ice crept south along the Norwegian coast. Rivers and lakes locked solid. Snow accumulated in drifts that reshaped the land into smoother, quieter versions of itself. The farmsteads that dotted this landscape were isolated. No villages in the way later centuries would build them. Each family occupied its own cluster of buildings. Longhouse outbuildings for storage, perhaps a separate structure for animals if the household was prosperous enough to build more than one shelter. These farmsteads could be separated by kilometers of forest, mountain, or frozen fjord. Travel between them in winter required skis, determination, and necessity. Most households turned inward when the snow came. The world contracted to the boundaries of the farm, the woodlot, the immediate sources of water and fuel. This was the environment that shaped every choice about shelter and sleep. The cold was not occasional. It was the constant condition against which all other planning occurred. Iceland, settled by Norse farmers beginning in the 870s, faced even harsher winters. The island sits just below the Arctic Circle, exposed to North Atlantic storms with no mountain ranges to break the wind. Temperatures hovered near or below freezing from October through April. Darkness ruled. The volcanic soil, thin and recent, offered little natural protection. Yet people lived there, raised families, slept through the winter and woke in spring to plant barley and tend lambs. The longhouse was the answer to this landscape, not the only answer. Other cultures solved similar problems differently, but the particular solution that emerged from Scandinavian materials, climate, and social structure. The isolation mattered for sleep. There was no running to a neighbor's fire if your own died, no communal hall to retreat to when your own shelter failed. Each household was responsible for its own warmth, its own survival, every night from autumn through spring. The long nights mattered too. Darkness arrived in mid-afternoon during the deep winter months, 16, 18 hours of night. Sleep could not fill all of that time. People woke, tended fires, worked by firelight, slept again. The night became a space to inhabit, not simply to pass through unconscious. And the cold shaped everything. It determined what you built your house from, how thick the walls needed to be, where you placed the fire, how you arranged bodies on sleeping platforms, what you wore to bed, how many furs you needed to survive until morning. This was not cold as modern people experience it, an inconvenience between the heated car and the heated building. This was cold as a constant physical pressure. It entered through every gap, settled in every corner, waited for the fire to die. The Viking Age winter was a problem that required solving not once but every single night. For half the year, year after year, generation after generation. The solution began with the ground itself. The longhouse was a specific response to a specific problem. Its shape was not chosen for beauty or tradition, though tradition certainly reinforced it. The form emerged from the physics of heat and the materials available to Scandinavian farmers with limited labor and technology. Long, rectangular, low. These characteristics define the structure. A typical longhouse measured 15 to 30 meters in length. Width varied less, usually between 4 and 8 meters. The proportions created a narrow hall, a corridor of space rather than an open room. This shape minimized the surface area exposed to wind while maximizing the interior volume, where heat could be trapped. A square building of the same floor area would lose heat more quickly. The long, narrow form reduced the ratio of exterior wall to interior space. The walls were thick, not thin partitions, but massive barriers between inside and outside. 1 to 2 meters of material stood between the cold and the inhabited space. This thickness was structural necessity and insulation combined. Height was limited. At the center ridgeline, where the roof peaked, the interior clearance reached perhaps 2 to 3 meters. Along the edges, where the roof sloped down to meet the walls, the space compressed. The low profile reduced the volume of air that needed heating and presented less surface for wind to strike. The roof itself was turf-covered, adding another layer of insulation and considerable weight. The structure had to support not just the roof timbers and sod, but the snow that would accumulate through the winter months. Inside, the longhouse was divided not by walls, but by function and furniture. The central hearth ran down the middle of the space, defining the spine of the hall. Along both long walls, raised wooden platforms created the sleeping and sitting areas. The ends of the building might hold storage, additional rooms, or entries that created buffer zones against the weather. This arrangement concentrated human activity along a narrow axis. The fire at the center, people on either side. Heat rising from the hearth to fill the space before escaping through vents in the roof. The form was remarkably consistent across Scandinavia and the Norse settlements in Iceland and Greenland. Local variations existed. Icelandic longhouses often had slightly different proportions, adapting to treeless landscapes where timber was precious. But the basic pattern repeated. This consistency suggests the design worked. It solved the problem well enough that generation after generation replicated it, with only minor modifications. The longhouse was not a single-room structure in the way that phrase might suggest to modern thinking. It was one continuous space, yes, but that space held distinct zones. The high seat area, where the household head sat and slept, occupied a specific location. The areas near the doors were colder, lower status. The hearth created a gradient of warmth that organized social position as much as any wall would. At night, when the household settled to sleep, the longhouse became a carefully arranged system of bodies, fire, and insulation. Everyone under one roof, everyone breathing the same smoky air, everyone dependent on the same fire for survival. The building itself was a tool, a technology for creating a pocket of warmth in a landscape that offered none. Archaeological excavations reveal the pattern clearly. At Borg in Lofoten, the chieftain's longhouse measured 83 meters, an exceptional length, but the proportions followed the standard model. At Stong in Iceland, preserved under volcanic ash from an eruption in 1104, the longhouse measured 28 meters long and 5 meters wide. The consistency across time and distance is striking. These were not temporary shelters. A longhouse represented years of labor and substantial resources. Trees felled and shaped into timbers, turf cut and stacked, stone gathered for the hearth and foundation. The construction required planning, skill, and community effort. Once built, a longhouse might serve multiple generations. Maintenance was constant. Turf needed replacing, timbers might rot and require repair. But the basic structure endured. The investment made sense only if the design worked. If families froze in poorly conceived buildings, the form would not have persisted. The longhouse survived in the archaeological record and in the historical memory because it succeeded at its fundamental task. It kept people alive through the winter. It made sleep possible in temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in hours. The form was the foundation, but the true ingenuity lay in the materials. Outro outside, the wind continues across frozen ground. Smoke rises from the roof vent, thin and steady, the only movement in the darkness. Inside, the family sleeps. The fire glows low. Breath rises and falls beneath layers of wool and fur. The cold presses against turf walls, but does not enter. This was survival, not dramatic, not filled with crisis, just the accumulated knowledge of generations applied to the simple problem of making it through another winter night. Earth and wood, wool and fire, bodies arranged to share warmth. These were the materials of sleep in the Viking Age. The longhouse stands in the darkness, as it stood 1,000 winters ago. Let the image fade now. Let your thoughts settle like snow. Rest well. The walls rose from the ground in layers of cut turf, blocks of earth and grass sliced from nearby meadows, stacked one upon another. Grass side down, root systems still intact. This was deliberate, precise. The turf became the primary building material not because stone was unavailable or wood was scarce. It was chosen because earth itself, still living, created something no other material could match in the cold months: insulation. The turf blocks locked together as they settled. Roots from one layer grew into the layer beneath. Over weeks and months, the wall became a unified mass, not individual pieces, but a continuous thickness of soil wrapped around a wooden frame. That frame, the skeleton, was timber, oak or pine when available, birch in regions where larger trees were scarce, vertical posts at intervals, horizontal beams connecting them, creating the shape and bearing the roof's weight. But the frame alone would not keep out winter. The earth did that work. A turf wall might measure 1 meter thick, sometimes more at the base, where weight compressed the lower blocks and where builders added extra layers for stability, sometimes reaching 2 meters where the wall met frozen ground. That thickness was not structural excess. Every centimeter mattered. Air trapped within the root systems. Air trapped between the turf and the inner wooden wall. Air trapped in the organic complexity of decomposing plant matter. These dead air spaces, thousands of them, microscopic and small, stopped the movement of heat. Cold could not push through easily. Warmth could not escape readily. The outer surface of the wall faced the weather. Wind, snow, freezing rain, temperatures far below zero. But the inner surface, the wall you would touch from inside the longhouse, remained relatively warm, not hot, not comfortable by modern standards, but warmer than the night air by many degrees. This was thermal mass at work. The earth absorbed heat slowly during the day when the fire burned and bodies moved through the space. It released that heat slowly at night when the fire burned lower and the family slept. The walls themselves became a heat reservoir, charging and discharging across the hours. The roof followed similar principles. Birch bark formed the first layer, laid across the timber rafters. Flexible, relatively waterproof, it created a barrier against moisture from above. Then turf again, cut in sections, placed grass side up this time so the living plants would continue growing, their roots binding the roof into a unified surface. A living roof, green in summer, insulating in winter. Holding snow that added another layer of protection when the cold deepened. The construction process required knowledge passed across generations. Which meadow soil cut cleanly, which turf held together when lifted. How long to let the blocks rest before stacking, how to angle each layer so water would drain outward instead of seeping in. This was not simple labor. It was sophisticated material science, practiced without formal theory but refined through centuries of winters that punished mistakes and rewarded careful observation. The turf came from carefully selected locations, not just any ground. The best turf grew in meadows where grass roots formed dense mats, where soil composition balanced clay and organic matter. Too much sand and the blocks crumbled. Too much clay, and they held water, turning heavy and unstable. Builders recognized good turf by feel and sight, the way it cut, the way it held its shape, the thickness of the root layer. They cut blocks in late summer or early autumn, allowing time for construction before the ground froze. Each block measured roughly the length of a man's forearm, the width of his hand, the thickness of his palm. Not standardized in formal measurements, but consistent enough that experienced builders knew how many blocks would be needed for a given length of wall. The cutting itself required specific tools. Long-bladed turf spades sharpened regularly, capable of slicing through root systems without excessive tearing. Clean cuts mattered. Ragged edges meant gaps, and gaps meant cold air finding paths inward. Once cut, the blocks were carried to the building site. Stacked nearby but not immediately used, they needed to settle slightly to lose some moisture but not dry completely. Too wet, and they would compress too much under the wall's weight. Too dry, and they would crumble when handled. The actual wall construction began with the heaviest blocks at the base, each layer set slightly inward from the one below, creating a gradual slope. This offset the weight's downward thrust, preventing the wall from bulging outward over time. It also shed rainwater more effectively. As the wall rose, builders integrated the wooden framework. Posts set into the ground or onto stone foundations, then turf built up around them, locking them in place. The wood and earth became a single structural system. Neither could stand alone under the roof's weight and the wind's pressure. Together, they held. The final height varied. Some longhouses had walls tall enough for a person to stand comfortably inside. Others were lower, requiring inhabitants to move through a more compressed interior space where heat concentrated more efficiently. Always, the principle remained the same. Wrap the living space in earth. Use the ground's natural resistance to temperature change. Create thickness between inside and outside. This was what separated survival from suffering in the winter months. Not wealth, not status. The quality of the walls. The care taken in their construction. The understanding of how earth behaves when asked to hold warmth against the cold. Year after year, the turf walls stood. Roots grew. Grasses flowered briefly in summer. Snow piled against them in winter. And inside, through the long darkness, the temperature remained bearable because someone, long ago, learned that the solution to cold was not fighting it with fire alone. It was wrapping the fire in earth. The location came before the walls. Before the first turf was cut or timber shaped, someone stood on the land and considered the wind. This was not arbitrary choice, not simply claiming flat ground near water. The placement of a longhouse determined whether the family inside would endure winter or suffer through it. Wind mattered most. Prevailing winds in Scandinavia blow primarily from the west and southwest, carrying moisture from the Atlantic, driving storms across the landscape. A longhouse built with its broadside facing these winds caught the full force. Cold air found every gap, pressed against the walls constantly, stripped heat away. The solution was orientation. The long axis of the house ran roughly east-west, presenting the narrow gable ends to the prevailing wind. Less surface area exposed, less pressure against the walls, less cold air forcing its way toward the warmth inside. Archaeological evidence confirms this pattern across hundreds of sites. The longhouses align with remarkable consistency, their narrow ends facing the direction from which winter storms arrive. But wind direction alone did not determine placement. The land itself offered protection when used properly. Hills and slopes became tools. A longhouse built into the side of a hill or positioned just below the crest gained shelter from the land's mass. Wind rising up the slope passed overhead instead of striking the walls directly. The earth itself became a windbreak. This also allowed builders to bank soil against the northern wall, the side that received no direct sunlight, even in summer. Additional earth piled and shaped increased the wall's effective thickness without requiring more turf blocks. The hill and the house merged, becoming a single form. Some sites show longhouses positioned in shallow valleys protected on multiple sides by rising ground. Others nestle against ridgelines, using the terrain to deflect the hardest gusts. The common element is attention to how air moves across landscape. Water access mattered, but differently than wind. A stream or spring needed to be close enough for daily use, but not so close that moisture saturated the ground beneath the house. Damp earth under the floor meant cold rising through the structure, meant bedding that never fully dried, meant the constant chill of evaporation drawing heat away. Well-drained ground was essential. Slight slopes where water would run off rather than pool. Sandy or gravelly soil beneath the turf, allowing moisture to percolate downward instead of sitting at the surface. Builders tested this, dug into the ground to see how water behaved, observed where snow melted first in spring, indicating better drainage, noted where puddles formed after rain, and avoided those areas. Firewood supply influenced the decision as well. Winter survival required enormous quantities of wood. A household might burn through several cords across the cold months, feeding the central hearth day and night. Hauling that wood long distances through snow was not merely inconvenient, it was a dangerous expenditure of calories and energy. Proximity to woodland, or at least to areas where dead timber could be gathered, shaped site selection. But this had to balance against the need for sheltered ground. Sometimes the most protected building site was not the closest to trees. Builders made calculations, weighing the labor of carrying wood against the cost of fighting wind. South-facing slopes received more sun, even the weak winter sun that barely cleared the horizon. A longhouse positioned to catch that light gained marginal warmth, a few degrees perhaps, but those degrees accumulated over months. They meant slightly less firewood burned, slightly more comfort, slightly better odds. In Iceland and the far northern settlements, considerations shifted. The treelessness of the landscape meant imported driftwood or carefully managed scrub willow. Building sites clustered where any fuel source existed, where sheep could graze in summer, where the land offered any advantage at all against the climate's extremity. There, turf became even more critical. With minimal wood for construction, the earth itself provided almost everything. Walls, roofs, sometimes even interior partitions, all turf, cut from the only abundant material available. The relationship between house and landscape was not one of dominance. Vikings did not clear hilltops and build fortresses. They found the places where the land itself offered help. A fold in the terrain, a slope angled just right, a spot where the wind passed overhead instead of through. They observed how snow drifted, where it piled deep and where it scoured away. They noticed which areas held warmth in autumn, where frost came first in late summer. This knowledge, accumulated across seasons and generations, guided the choice of where to dig the first post hole. The decision carried weight. A longhouse once built stood for decades. Some sites show evidence of continuous occupation across centuries, each generation rebuilding on the same foundation, the same sheltered spot that had proven its worth through winter after winter. Moving a longhouse was not impossible, but it was enormously costly in labor and materials. The initial placement had to be right. The orientation toward wind, the relationship to terrain, the access to resources, all of it needed to work together. This was not folk wisdom or superstition. It was practical physics applied through direct observation. Understanding that cold air drains downhill and pools in low areas, so building slightly elevated avoided the coldest pockets. Recognizing that certain exposures to wind created turbulence that pulled heat from walls, while other angles allowed smoother flow. Site selection represented one of the first critical decisions in the architecture of winter survival. Before the walls rose, before the roof took shape, before the hearth was laid, someone chose the ground. That choice determined how much the land would help or hinder the work of staying alive when darkness and cold arrived. The doorway was low. A person approaching a longhouse on a winter night would need to stoop to enter. This was not an architectural accident. The opening stood perhaps 1.5 meters high, sometimes less. Anyone crossing the threshold had to bend forward, lowering their head and shoulders, changing their body position to fit through the narrow passage. This design served a specific thermal purpose. Cold air is denser than warm air. It settles low. A tall doorway would allow interior warmth to pour out into the night every time the door opened, replaced immediately by a column of freezing exterior air. The low opening reduced this exchange. Heat remained trapped near the ceiling. Cold stayed outside or entered only at floor level, where its impact mattered least. Some longhouses used a double-door system. An outer door opened to a small vestibule space, perhaps 1 meter deep. Then a second door led to the main hall. This created a primitive airlock. A person entered the first threshold, closed the outer door behind them, then opened the inner door. The vestibule absorbed the shock of cold air. The temperature dropped there, not in the living space where the family slept. The doors themselves were thick wood, often double-layered. Wool or hide was packed into gaps around the frame. In the coldest periods, frost formed on the interior surface of the door, white crystals spreading across the wood grain, despite the fire burning several meters away. The threshold was the weakest point in the longhouse's thermal envelope. Every possible method was used to reinforce it. Crossing from outside to inside created a profound sensory transition. Outside, the cold was sharp and immediate. It entered through every gap in clothing. It stung exposed skin. The air smelled of nothing, or of snow, or of the mineral scent of frozen earth. Wind moved constantly, pulling heat away from the body faster than flesh could generate it. Darkness was complete except for stars or moon reflecting off snow. Silence was broken only by wind. The person stooped, pushed the outer door open, stepped into the vestibule, pulled the door closed behind them, shutting out the wind. Already the difference registered. Still cold, but the cutting edge was gone. No wind. The air was still. They opened the inner door. Warmth met them immediately. Not as comfort, but as physical presence. The temperature difference could be 30 degrees or more. Air that had been well below freezing gave way to air warmed by fire and bodies and the trapped heat of thick walls. The contrast was so sharp it could make skin tingle, almost painful as blood vessels expanded. Smoke filled the upper portion of the space. It hung thick near the ceiling, a gray-brown haze that absorbed what little light the fire produced. Below, the air was clearer. A person standing upright would have their head in smoke. Stooping to enter, they remained in the breathable layer. The smell was immediate and complex. Wood smoke dominated, but beneath it were other scents. Wool, both clean and worn. The lanolin that remained in unwashed fleece. Cooking smells if food had been prepared that evening. The mineral scent of earth from the walls and floor. Animal smells if livestock were housed in partitioned sections. Human scent, the accumulated presence of bodies in an enclosed space with limited ventilation. The darkness was not complete. In the center of the hall, embers glowed red. During active burning, flames provided light enough to see movement, shapes, the general layout of the space. After the fire was banked for night, only embers remained. They cast a dim red glow, enough for eyes to adjust to, enough to navigate by, but not enough to see details clearly. Shadows moved on the walls. The turf absorbed almost all light, but the flicker of flames created subtle shifts in darkness, patterns that changed as wood shifted and fell in the fire. Above, where smoke gathered, there was only blackness. The ceiling timbers disappeared into it. The floor was earth, sometimes packed clay, sometimes covered with flat stones in wealthier households. It was cold despite the fire. Heat rose. The floor remained the coldest surface. in the longhouse, drawing warmth from anything that touched it. People did not linger standing. They moved to the raised sleeping platforms along the walls or sat near the hearth where radiant heat was strongest. The transition from outside to inside was the transition from a world that could kill to a world that sustained life. The difference was measured in degrees of temperature, but the experience was absolute. Outside, a person caught without shelter on a winter night would die. Inside, surrounded by thick earth walls and warmed by fire, sleep was possible. The threshold mattered. Every time the door opened, cold entered. Every time someone passed through, heat escaped. The household was careful. Doors were opened only when necessary. Movements outside were planned and grouped together. Firewood was brought in during daylight, enough to last through the night. Water was carried in. Livestock were checked before the family settled for sleep. Once the inner door closed for the night, it stayed closed until morning. In the coldest months, frost crept under the door. It formed along the bottom edge, where the seal was imperfect. Ice crystals grew inward, white fingers reaching into the warm space, melting slowly in the heat, but reforming during the coldest pre-dawn hours when the fire burned lowest. The door represented the boundary between survival and death. It was maintained carefully. Wood was checked for warping. Seals were reinforced with whatever materials were available. The hinges, if they existed, were kept functional. If the door was simply a slab of wood fitted into the opening, the fit was kept tight. A person entering the longhouse in winter left one world and entered another. The stooping posture required was not just physical necessity. It was a kind of acknowledgement, a bodily recognition that the space beyond was different, governed by different rules, sustained by different forces than the frozen darkness outside. They straightened once inside, let their eyes adjust to the dim red glow, felt warmth begin to penetrate their clothing, moved toward the fire or toward their sleeping place along the wall. The door closed behind them. The cold remained outside. The interior was not bright. Even with the fire burning actively, the light was limited. Flames provided illumination for a few meters around the hearth, enough to see faces, hands, the immediate workspace. Beyond that radius, the longhouse faded into shadow. The far ends of the hall, where doors led outside or where storage occupied the corners, remained dark. The walls, thick turf covered inside with wood planking or left as packed earth, absorbed light rather than reflecting it. This was not a space designed for visibility. It was designed for warmth. The ceiling was low. At the center ridgeline, the height might reach 2.5 or 3 meters. Along the walls, where the roof sloped downward, a person could touch the beams overhead. The timbers were often blackened from years of smoke exposure, wood grain obscured under a coating of soot and creosote. These beams supported the roof structure, which carried the weight of turf layers above. Smoke filled the upper portion of the hall. It accumulated below the roof, trapped by the same insulation that kept heat inside. The smoke layer was visible as a distinct boundary, a gray-brown ceiling that marked the division between breathable air and the thick haze above. The smoke hole in the roof allowed some ventilation, but it was kept small to minimize heat loss. Smoke escaped slowly, lingering for hours, sometimes days, before fully clearing. Below the smoke layer, the air was relatively clear. A person sitting or moving at normal height could breathe without difficulty. Children playing on the floor experienced the cleanest air. Adults standing had their heads near the boundary. This gradient was understood and accepted. People adjusted their position based on what they were doing and how thick the smoke had become. The floor was cold. Earth or stone held no warmth. Heat from the fire radiated outward and upward, warming the air and the wooden platforms along the walls. But the floor remained near the temperature of the ground itself. In winter, this meant it was cold enough to draw heat from bare feet or from anyone sitting directly on it. People used the floor for movement, not for resting. Activity happened on the raised platforms or near the hearth, where warmth concentrated. The windows, if they existed, were small. Some longhouses had no windows at all, relying entirely on the door and smoke hole for ventilation and light. Others had narrow openings, perhaps 30 centimeters across, covered with animal membranes stretched thin enough to allow dim light through, or with wooden shutters that could be opened in milder weather and sealed tight in winter. These openings were placed high on the walls, above the sleeping platforms, positioned to admit light without creating drafts at living height. In winter, the windows stayed covered. The membrane or shutter created a barrier, imperfect but necessary. Even a small opening allowed heat to escape and cold to seep inward. The trade was accepted. Darkness was preferable to cold. Vision mattered less than warmth. The light that did exist came from the hearth. During the day, if the fire was burning well, flames provided enough illumination for handwork, for food preparation, for moving around the interior without stumbling. Faces were visible. Expressions could be read. Tools could be found and used. At night, when the fire was banked for sleep, the light reduced to a dim red glow. Embers pulsed with heat, visible as spots of deep orange-red among the ash and charcoal. This glow was enough for eyes adjusted to darkness. A person waking in the night could see shapes, could make out the hearth's location, could navigate to the fire if it needed tending. Details disappeared. Everything became silhouette and shadow. Shadows moved constantly. Flames never burned steadily. They flickered, shifted, rose and fell as air currents fed them, or as wood collapsed into new configurations. The shadows cast on the walls moved with the flames. A person sitting near the fire would see their own shadow dance across the turf wall, elongated and distorted, merging with the shadows of others, fragmenting when the fire flared and reforming when it settled. The space above the smoke layer was invisible. No light penetrated that far. The roof timbers disappeared into blackness. During the day, thin shafts of light might come through the smoke hole, cutting through the haze at an angle, illuminating the particles suspended in the air. At night, there was only darkness overhead. The architecture above the smoke layer was known by memory and by the sounds it made, the creak of beams settling, the occasional shift of turf, the drip of condensation, but it could not be seen. This darkness was not frightening, it was familiar. Children were born into it and grew accustomed to limited light. Adults had spent their lives navigating these interiors. The absence of bright illumination was normal. Eyes adapted. Other senses became more important. Sound carried clearly. The fire crackled. Wood popped as pockets of sap heated and burst. Voices echoed slightly off the hard surfaces. Footsteps on the earthen floor were audible. The breathing of sleepers could be heard from across the hall. In the partitioned sections where livestock were housed, animals shifted and made low sounds. The movement of hooves, the rustle of straw, the occasional bleat or low. Smell provided information. Smoke indicated the fire's condition. A sharp, thick smoke meant green wood or poor ventilation. A lighter smoke meant dry fuel burning cleanly. Food smells announced meals. The scent of wool indicated someone working with textile. The mineral smell of damp earth meant moisture seeping through the walls, something to monitor and address. The space was not large by modern standards, but it was large enough to hold a family, their possessions, food stores, tools, and sometimes animals. The usable area, the portion not filled with storage or livestock, might be 30 or 40 square meters. This was the domain of daily life. Everything happened here. Cooking, eating, handwork, social interaction, and sleep all occurred within the same enclosed volume. The walls were close. A person standing at the center of the hall could walk to a wall in a few steps. The enclosure was constant and complete. There was no view outward except through the brief opening of a door. No sense of the landscape beyond. No connection to the sky or horizon. The longhouse interior was its own world, bounded by turf and timber, lit by fire, filled with smoke and warmth, and the presence of others. This was the space where winter was spent, where night after night the family gathered and slept, where darkness was not something to fear, but something to inhabit. The fire glowed in the center. Shadows moved on the walls. Smoke hung overhead. The cold remained outside. The long hearth ran down the center of the hall like a spine, not against a wall, not tucked into a corner, down the middle of the living space, stretching sometimes 5 meters or more in the larger longhouses. A rectangle lined with flat stones set directly into the earthen floor, or atop a slightly raised platform of packed clay. This was not decoration. This was the organizing principle of the entire household. The stones themselves told the story. Archaeologists excavating longhouse sites find hearthstones darkened by centuries of use, cracked from thermal stress, embedded so deeply that they remained in place long after the timber and turf walls collapsed. Some hearths maintained in the exact same location for generations. The same stones heating the same space, winter after winter, as families lived and died around them. The fire determined everything else. Where people sat, where they worked, where they slept. The raised platforms along the walls oriented themselves to the hearth. The high seat, the position of honor where the household head sat, claimed the spot with optimal warmth and visibility along the hearth's length. Everything else arranged itself in relation to the flames. The hearth was not simply wide enough for cooking. It was long enough to radiate heat along the entire central corridor of the hall. In a house sheltering 20 or 30 people through a Scandinavian winter, this mattered. A single fire in a corner would create zones of warmth and cold. But a fire running down the center created a corridor of heat that reached toward both sleeping platforms, both working areas, both ends of the shared space. The stone lining served multiple purposes. It contained the fire, preventing it from spreading to the earthen floor, or the straw that inevitably scattered across the ground. It retained heat, absorbing warmth during active burning and radiating it back into the room as flames died down. It created a stable base for cooking equipment and allowed coals to be raked into specific zones for different tasks. Iron chains hung from the roof beams above the hearth. These suspended cooking pots over the flames, adjustable in height depending on the intensity of heat needed. The chains themselves appeared in archaeological finds, corroded but recognizable, and in saga references to the equipment of a functioning household. The fire was never just for warmth. It cooked the evening meal. It provided the only light during the 18 to 20 hours of winter darkness in the northern settlements. It dried damp clothing. It kept tools workable. Iron that froze became brittle. It created the social center where work happened, where stories were told, where the family gathered because there was nowhere else warm enough to sit. The Norse language itself reflected this centrality. Phrases in the sagas reference feeding the fire as a fundamental household duty. The hearth appears in legal codes defining what constituted a legitimate dwelling. A house was not simply a structure. It was a structure with a hearth. The fire made it a home. The flames and the family moved through the day together. Morning fire building, midday cooking, evening warmth as darkness closed in. And through the night, the slow burn of carefully placed logs that would hold heat until someone woke to feed them again. You could map status by distance from the hearth. The high seat positions, those claimed by the household head and honored guests, faced the fire at optimal range, close enough for warmth, far enough to avoid smoke and sparks. Children and lower status household members took positions farther out, closer to the cold walls, or at the ends of the hall where heat dissipated, but everyone oriented to the same center. The work of daily life happened around the hearth. Women at their textile work positioned themselves within reach of the light and warmth. Men repairing tools or working leather claimed spots along the hearth's length. The fire was the one place everyone needed, and therefore the one place that determined all other positions. The hearth fire created time as much as it created warmth, the rhythm of feeding it, the progression from morning building to evening banking, the overnight tending. These marked the hours when sunlight disappeared for months. The fire state told you what part of the night you had reached. Fresh flames meant evening. Deep coals glowing red meant the middle hours. Ash covering fading embers meant dawn approached, and someone needed to wake. Letting the fire die completely was avoided whenever possible. Relighting required work, striking sparks with iron and flint onto tinder, coaxing the first fragile flame, building it carefully into something sustainable. Much easier to keep it alive. Burying coals in ash before sleep so they would hold heat until morning, when fresh wood could be added. Some fires burned from autumn to spring without full extinction. Season after season, the same hearth held the same fundamental flame, fed continuously across the months when cold made survival a daily negotiation. This was not superstition. This was efficiency. Fire was precious. Labor was limited. Once you had warmth, you kept it. The hearth existed in all weather, all seasons. But in winter, it transformed from convenience to necessity. The difference between the hall with its fire and the frozen landscape outside was the difference between life and something close to its absence. The stones held that difference. The flames maintained it. And the family organized itself around the heat that made sleep possible when darkness and cold pressed against the turf walls for months without relief. Someone had to wake, not at dawn, not at a predetermined hour, but whenever the fire needed it, when the flames died back to coals, when the warmth began to fade from the stones, when the cold started creeping back across the earthen floor toward the sleeping platforms. This was not a single person's task every night. It rotated, different members of the household taking turns through the winter, rising from warm furs into the cold air to add wood to the hearth. The saga literature does not detail these rotations explicitly, but the physical reality demanded them. A fire burning 12 to 16 hours overnight required tending. Someone had to do it. The watch rotation likely followed household hierarchy, but not in the way that placed the highest status members on duty. Thralls and lower status household members carried more of the burden. Older children took shifts. The household head might wake to tend the fire, but this was shared labor, too important to leave to a single person who might sleep through the critical moment when coals faded to ash. You woke in darkness. The only light came from the hearth itself, perhaps flames still visible, perhaps just the red glow of coals beneath a layer of ash. You left the warm nest of furs and wool, feeling the immediate cold of the air against your face and hands. Your breath condensed. The sleeping platform's warmth disappeared the moment you stood. You crossed to the hearth, barefoot or in loosened boots, moving carefully through a space packed with sleeping bodies. The hall was never silent, breathing of 30 people. The occasional cough or shift of position, animal sounds from the partitioned livestock area, wind against the turf roof. The fire itself made sound, the crackle of remaining flames, the settling of logs as they burned through and collapsed into coals, the faint hiss of moisture leaving wood. You added wood carefully, not large pieces that would smother the coals, not so much that the sudden flame would fill the hall with smoke and wake everyone. Small splits first, placed to catch the heat still radiating from the coals. Once they caught, larger pieces, building the fire back up to a point where it would sustain itself for another few hours. The firewood came from stores gathered during summer and autumn. The labor of fuel collection defined those seasons as much as any other work, cutting, hauling, splitting, stacking under cover to keep it dry. In forested areas of Norway and Sweden, this meant timber. In treeless Iceland, peat cut from bogs and dried in the brief summer. In northern coastal areas, driftwood scavenged from beaches and supplemented with dried animal dung. The quantity required was enormous. Archaeological calculations based on hearth size, house dimensions, and climate data suggest a single household might burn through several cords of wood across a winter. That meant months of summer labor invested in winter survival. Every piece of wood added to the overnight fire represented hours of work from the previous season. Rationing mattered, especially in the late winter months when stored fuel supplies ran lowest and the landscape remained frozen. You could not simply go cut more wood when the snow was deep and the days still short. What you had needed to last until spring. The overnight fire was tended carefully, kept alive but not burning wastefully. Peat burned differently than wood, slower, with less flame, but steady heat. In Iceland, where trees were scarce even in the Viking Age, peat became the primary fuel. Dry dung burned hot and fast, useful for cooking, less practical for overnight warmth. The fuel sources available shaped how the fire was maintained through the dark hours. The fire tender stayed up long enough to ensure the new wood caught, sitting near the warmth for a few minutes, watching the flames grow, making sure the smoke drew properly up toward the roof vents rather than spilling out into the sleeping areas. Then back to the sleeping platform, back under the furs, back into the pocket of warmth created by your own body and those sleeping near you. This happened multiple times each night, different people waking. The fire never allowed to die completely, but also never built so large that fuel was wasted. The rhythm of tending became automatic across the winter months. Your body learned when to wake. You knew by the air temperature or the quality of darkness whether the fire needed attention. Children learned this work early. Fire tending was fundamental household knowledge, as essential as any other survival skill. A child old enough to walk was old enough to start learning how to read a fire's needs, which wood to add when, how to build heat without creating smoke. By adolescence, they took their place in the rotation of overnight tending. The cultural importance of firekeeping appeared in language. Old Norse had specific vocabulary for different fire states, different stages of burning, different qualities of flame and coal. This was not poetic elaboration. This was precision born from necessity. The fire's condition mattered, and the words reflected gradations that made a difference in a house where warmth meant survival. Some fires burned from autumn through spring without full extinction. The evening fire was banked, coals covered with ash to slow their burning, preserve their heat, allow them to smolder overnight. Come morning, the ash was raked aside, fresh kindling added, and the fire built back to full strength from coals that had never completely died. Season after season, the same fundamental flame, maintained through human attention every single night. Relighting from scratch was avoided when possible. It took time. Striking iron against flint to shower sparks onto tinder, charred cloth, dried moss, fine wood shavings, coaxing the spark into a fragile flame, building it carefully through increasing sizes of fuel, easier by far to keep the fire alive than to birth it anew each day. But fires did go out. Someone slept too long. The fuel was too green or too wet. The overnight portion burned faster than expected. Then came the morning work of relighting, and the household's routines adjusted around the delay. Breakfast waited. Warmth took longer to build. The day started colder. The fire was the one element that could not be ignored. Clothing could be layered. Food could be eaten cold, if necessary. But the hearth fire determined whether the hall remained habitable. Every person who woke in darkness to feed it understood this. The flames were not maintained out of tradition or comfort. They were maintained because without them, sleep became dangerous, and winter became something that killed rather than something that was simply endured. The longhouse had no chimney. Smoke rose from the hearth, lifted by heat into the upper darkness, and hung there. It filled the space beneath the turf roof in a thick, shifting layer. Then, slowly, it filtered out through gaps in the eaves and through the smoke hole cut above the fire. This was intentional design, not oversight. The smoke layer created insulation. Warm air mixed with smoke collected against the roof and held heat inside before gradually escaping. The system worked through stratification. Hot smoke rose and stayed high. Cooler, clearer air remained at living height. The boundary between the two was not sharp, but it was real enough. A person standing would put their head into smoke. A person sitting would breathe air that carried only faint haze. The architecture determined posture. People sat to weave, to eat, to talk. They lay down to sleep. The longhouse favored the horizontal. Smoke permeated everything. Clothing absorbed it. Hair held the smell. Wooden surfaces darkened with deposits over years. Roof beams accumulated soot layers several centimeters thick, building up season after season until the timber turned black and hard. This coating acted as preservative. It sealed the wood against rot and insects. Food hung from the rafters. Dried fish, cured meat, absorbed smoke that helped preserve it through winter months. The smoke came primarily from wood fires, but also from peat in regions where trees grew sparse. The smell varied. Birch smoke carried one scent, pine another. Peat produced earthy, dense smoke that hung heavier and longer. Eyes adjusted. The first hours inside a smoke-filled longhouse would have caused watering and irritation for someone unaccustomed. But people who lived there year-round developed tolerance. Children raised in this environment knew no other baseline. The irritation that would seem unbearable to an outsider became simply the texture of indoor air. Chronic exposure carried consequences. Lung damage likely accumulated over lifetimes. Respiratory problems would have been common among those who spent decades breathing smoke-laden air. But this cost was weighed against freezing. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant survival. The choice was not between clean air and smoky air. It was between smoky warmth and fatal cold. The smoke layer also created privacy of a kind. In the dim light, with smoke obscuring the upper portions of the hall, the far end of the longhouse disappeared into haze. The family sleeping 20 feet away became indistinct shapes. Sound carried, but sight was limited. The smoke created visual separation in a space that had no walls to divide it. When wind conditions changed outside, the smoke behaved differently. Strong winds could create backdrafts that pushed smoke downward, filling the lower portions of the hall until the fire was adjusted or the weather shifted. Calm, cold nights allowed smoke to hang especially thick. Experience taught people to read smoke patterns, to predict when air would clear and when it would worsen, to adjust the fire and the roof vent accordingly. The roof vent itself required management. Too large an opening let precious heat escape. Too small allowed smoke to accumulate until breathing became difficult even at floor level. The vent could be partially covered with turf or wood, adjusted according to fire size, weather, and need. Someone had to make these judgments daily, reading the balance between warmth and breathability. In the coldest part of winter, the vent was kept as small as possible. Smoke built up thicker then. People tolerated it because every bit of heat mattered. The equation shifted toward warmth, accepting reduced air quality as necessary. In milder periods, the vent opened wider, smoke cleared faster, but more heat escaped into the night. Soot settled on everything. Wool textiles turned gray. Storage chests needed regular wiping. Any surface left exposed would darken over time. This was not viewed as dirt in the sense of disorder, but as the natural consequence of fire. Clean air and warm air could not coexist in winter. One required the other's absence. Some evidence suggests that certain longhouses had more sophisticated smoke management, multiple vents positioned to create draw patterns, partial interior partitions that channeled smoke toward exits. These refinements appeared in wealthier households or in later periods. But the basic condition remained. Living space and smoke space overlapped. The longhouse interior was always partly visible, partly obscured, always carrying the smell of burning wood and peat. People moved through this environment without complaint recorded in the sources that survive. Sagas do not mention smoke as hardship. It was too ordinary to note. The absence of comment suggests acceptance. This was what indoors meant in winter. This was the atmosphere of survival. The fire that created the smoke also created the light. The two could not be separated. To see in the darkness required flame. Flame produced smoke, light, and haze came together. The longhouse interior existed in a state of permanent dimness, warmed and obscured by the same source. At sleeping time, as people settled onto the platforms and pulled furs over themselves, the smoke continued its slow circulation above them. It rose from the banked fire, spread across the roof, seeped out into the frozen night. Below, in the clearer layer, the family breathed easier air and slept. The wooden platforms ran the length of both long walls. They were called setterstocker, raised benches built at a height of roughly half a meter above the earthen floor. The gap beneath them created storage space and, more importantly, kept sleepers elevated above the coldest air. Cold air settled, heat rose. This basic physics shaped the platform design. The floor, whether packed earth or stone, absorbed cold from the frozen ground beneath. Even with a fire burning in the center of the hall, the lowest layer of air remained several degrees colder than the air at waist height. Sleeping on the floor meant sleeping in that cold pool. The platforms lifted people into warmer air. The difference was measurable. 50 centimeters of elevation might mean the difference between breath misting visibly and breath disappearing into slightly warmer darkness. Over the course of a long winter night, that difference mattered. The platform stretched nearly the full length of the longhouse, interrupted only at the doorways. In a structure 15 meters long, the platforms provided perhaps 12 meters of sleeping surface on each side. Width varied, but typically measured 2 to 3 meters from the wall to the platform edge. This allowed multiple people to sleep side by side, perpendicular to the wall, with their heads toward the outer wall and feet toward the central hearth. Construction was simple: wooden posts driven into the floor or set into stone footings, horizontal beams connecting the posts. Planks laid across the beams to create the sleeping surface. The wood was usually left unfinished. Smoothness came from years of use, from bodies and textiles wearing away splinters and rough grain. Some platforms had raised edges at the head position, shaped logs or carved blocks that served as pillows. These were not soft. They supported the neck and kept the head elevated, but comfort was not the primary concern. The raised headrest kept the face further from the platform surface, allowing easier breathing and preventing hair from catching in the rough wood. The platforms served dual purposes. During daylight hours, they functioned as seating for work. People sat there to spin, weave, repair tools, prepare food. The elevation put work at a comfortable height. Light from the small windows, though dim, reached the platforms better than it reached floor level. The same surface that held sleeping bodies at night held waking activity by day. Evidence from archaeological sites shows wear patterns on platform edges where people sat most frequently. The wood there became smoother, slightly indented from years of weight and friction. These patterns indicate specific preferred positions, likely corresponding to household hierarchy and habit. The space beneath the platforms held storage chests, tools, extra textiles, anything that needed to be kept dry and accessible. This storage was critical in a one-room structure. The platforms created usable space above and below, maximizing the volume of the longhouse. The platforms themselves were not uniform along their length. The section closest to the high seat, the seat of honor typically located at the center of one long wall, held the most important sleeping positions: the household head, the senior woman, their children. Status determined proximity to this central, warmest location. Lesser household members, thralls, servants slept toward the ends of the platforms, nearer the doors where cold entered. Platform height also meant that anyone lying down had a clear view of the fire. This mattered for safety and for the psychological comfort of seeing the flame. A person sleeping on the floor would see only the underside of smoke, the darkness between themselves and the fire. A person on the platform could watch the flames directly, could assess the fire's condition without rising. The elevation prevented dampness. Earthen floors, even well-packed ones, held moisture. In winter, when snow was tracked in and melted, when condensation formed on cold surfaces, the floor became the wettest part of the longhouse. Raising the sleeping surface above this prevented bedding from absorbing ground moisture. Wet wool lost its insulating properties. Keeping textiles dry was essential to staying warm. The width of the platforms allowed families to cluster. A mother, father, and small children could occupy a section 2 meters wide, lying close together. Older children might share platform space with younger siblings or with household servants. The arrangements were dense but not random. Each person had a known place, a section of platform that was theirs by custom and hierarchy. The wooden surface under the bedding was hard. This was accepted. Softness came from the layers placed on top: straw, heather, textiles, furs. The platform itself was simply structure, the foundation that held those insulating layers at the correct height. Some longhouses show evidence of partial dividers between platform sections, low wooden partitions, perhaps half a meter high, that created slight separation between family groups or between different ranks of household members. These dividers did not provide privacy in any real sense, but they marked territory. They created symbolic boundaries in a physically open space. The platforms defined the sleeping geography of the longhouse. They established who slept where, who slept near whom, and who slept in the warmest or coldest positions. This geography was social structure made physical. It was visible, known, and largely unchanging, unless household composition shifted through birth, death, marriage, or the arrival and departure of servants. At night, as people settled onto the platforms and began layering themselves with textiles and furs, the wooden surface beneath them creaked. The sound of multiple bodies arranging themselves, finding positions, pulling coverings into place. This was the acoustic signal that the household was preparing for sleep. The platforms would hold them through the long darkness, raised above the cold floor, close to the lingering warmth from the fire. They would sleep. The wooden platform was not the bed itself. It was a foundation. What made sleep possible in freezing darkness was built on top of those raised planks, layer by layer, each one chosen for specific physical properties that together created warmth where the air itself held none. The first layer went down directly onto the wood. Dried heather in some regions, straw or meadow grass in others. Gathered during summer and autumn, dried thoroughly, then spread across the sleeping platform to a depth of several inches. This layer had multiple purposes. It created a soft surface above the hard planks. It trapped air in the spaces between dried stems. It absorbed some moisture from breath and bodies during the night, and it could be changed out when it compressed or became damp, pulled up and replaced with fresh material, while the old went to animal bedding or compost. In some longhouses, particularly where heather grew abundantly on nearby moorland, this plant became the primary bedding foundation. Its small woody branches created a springy surface. Its aromatic leaves released faint scent when compressed under body weight. Archaeological remains from Viking Age sites show quantities of heather stems in areas identified as sleeping quarters. The plant matter preserved in conditions too waterlogged or too dry for complete decomposition. Where heather was scarce, meadow grass served the same function. Cut in late summer, dried in the weak sun, or hung inside the longhouse during drier autumn days, then spread thick across the platforms. Straw from grain harvest worked as well, though it compressed faster and needed more frequent replacement. On top of this plant layer came textiles, woolen blankets, thick wadmail cloth, lengths of fabric woven during the lighter months on upright looms that stood against longhouse walls. The wool came from Scandinavian sheep bred over generations for fleece suited to extreme cold. Short stapled fiber. High lanolin content. Dense crimp that trapped air when spun and woven. The natural oils in the wool resisted moisture, allowing the fabric to maintain some insulating properties, even when dampened by breath and body moisture during long winter nights. Wadmal represented a specific textile technology. The fabric was woven from woolen yarn, then deliberately felted through moisture, heat, and pressure. The process tightened the weave, created a denser fabric, made the material nearly windproof. Vadmal in Old Norse. So important to the economy that it served as a unit of currency in Iceland and Norway, its value standardized by law. a fabric thick, enough that garments made from it stood almost rigid, heavy enough that a folded length provided substantial insulation between sleeper and the layer of straw below. These wool layers were not single blankets. Archaeological evidence and saga descriptions suggest multiple textile layers, each creating additional air pockets, each contributing to the thermal barrier between body and cold air. Then came the animal skins. Sheepskin was most common. Sheep provided wool throughout their lives, and meat and hide at slaughter. The skin with wool still attached, properly processed, became a sleeping fur that combined the insulating properties of the wool with the wind-blocking quality of the leather hide beneath. A sheepskin placed wool side up provided softness against the body. Placed hide side up with wool facing down toward other layers, it created a smooth surface that held other coverings in place. The specific processing mattered. Skins needed scraping to remove fat and tissue. Treatment with materials that prevented rot and kept the leather supple. In Scandinavia, this might involve birch bark extract, animal brains worked into the hide, or other tanning methods that left the leather soft enough for bedding use. A poorly processed skin would stiffen, crack, or decompose. A well-prepared sheepskin could last for years. Beyond sheepskin, other furs marked both regional availability and household wealth. Reindeer hide from northern regions and Iceland. Longer fur, excellent warmth. The hide itself was thicker than sheepskin, more durable. Sealskin from coastal communities. Different properties entirely. The fur shorter, denser, naturally water-resistant. Bear fur for those who hunted successfully or traded well. Wolf pelts. Each brought different thermal characteristics and different social meaning to the sleeping platform. The physics were consistent across all materials. Fur and wool trap air close to the body. Air is poor conductor of heat. The still air caught between fibers cannot carry warmth away from skin through convection. The more layers, the more air pockets, the more thermal zones between warm body and cold room. Each layer created a gradient. Body heat moved outward through the materials, but slowly each barrier slowing the transfer, keeping warmth close to the sleeper rather than letting it dissipate into the vast cold volume of the longhouse interior. The arrangement was not random. Straw or heather created the foundational air layer and absorbed ground cold, rising through the wooden platform. Wadmal and woolen blankets added flexible insulation that draped around body contours. Furs on top provided the final barrier and gave sleepers something soft to burrow into as the night cold deepened. During the coldest parts of winter, additional layers appeared. Extra cloaks that served as daytime garments became nighttime coverings. Smaller skins, and additional wool lengths. Anything that could trap air and hold warmth. The platform that might hold 2 layers in autumn could accumulate 4 or 5 by midwinter. The bedding rising thick enough that sleepers sank into it, surrounded on all sides by insulating material. This was not comfort in any modern sense. The materials were heavy. The furs could be stiff. Straw poked through wool in places. Everything smelled of lanolin, smoke, and the particular scent of the animals whose wool and skin now served human sleep. But comfort was not the measure. Warmth was. Survival through the dark hours was. Each household built these sleeping nests according to what they possessed. A wealthy family might sleep under bear fur and fine woven wadmal. A poorer household made do with coarser wool and sheepskin alone. But the principle remained identical, layer upon layer, air pocket upon air pocket. The patient accumulation of every scrap of insulation available, all directed toward the single goal of retaining the body's own heat through the long winter night. Position on the sleeping platform was not arbitrary. Where a person slept within the longhouse reflected their place in the household structure as clearly as any title or formal designation. The long platforms running down both sides of the hall created a social map, each section of the bench corresponding to status, relationship, and role. The central position on one platform, typically the southern or eastern side, though this varied by region and specific building orientation, was the high seat, the onvegi. This location belonged to the household head, the man who owned the land in Longhouse, who held authority over all who lived within the turf walls. In saga literature, this seat appears repeatedly as the defining position of power. The high seat was where the household head sat during the day, where he received guests, where his authority was literally seated. At night, this same position became his sleeping space. The woman who ran the household, managing the daily work, controlling the keys to storage chests, directing the domestic labor that made survival possible, typically slept at the corresponding central position on the opposite platform. The symmetry was not accidental. These two positions faced each other across the long hearth, the household's two authorities occupying the spatial heart of the home. Around these central positions, the household arranged itself in descending order of status and relationship. Children slept close to parents, young children especially. An infant might sleep directly beside the mother, close enough for nighttime feeding, for warmth, for the constant monitoring that kept a small child alive through winter. Older children clustered nearby, their smaller bodies benefiting from proximity to the warmth of adult masses, their safety watched over in the darkness. Other adult family members found positions based on their relationship to the household head. A brother might sleep near the high seat, an elderly parent in a position of respect, often given a spot with maximum warmth. Married sons who had not yet established their own households, adult daughters not yet married off, more distant relatives whose labor contributed to the household economy. Each had a recognized place on the platforms. Then came servants and laborers of free status. Household workers who were not enslaved but who worked for the family, perhaps for a season, perhaps for years. Their positions moved outward from the center, closer to the edges of the sleeping platforms, farther from the prime positions of warmth and status. Thralls, enslaved people who formed the lowest tier of the household hierarchy, slept in the least desirable positions, nearest the doors where cold air entered, at the far ends of the platforms farthest from the hearth's warmth. In some longhouses, slaves slept in separate, smaller chambers, or leaned to structures attached to the main hall, spaces with even less warmth and protection. The archaeological record at some sites shows smaller outbuildings that likely served this purpose, and saga references occasionally mention thralls sleeping apart from the free household. This geography was not formally marked. There were no partitions in most longhouses, no walls dividing the platforms into sections. The divisions existed in understood social practice, in the daily repetition of who sat and slept where, in the enforcement of hierarchy through spatial arrangement. Darkness made these positions less visible, but did not erase them. Even when firelight dimmed and the interior became nearly black, each person knew their place, moved to it, without needing to see clearly. Settled into the same section of platform they had occupied the night before, and would occupy the next night. The stability of these sleeping positions created order in darkness, prevented confusion, maintained social structure even in conditions where vision failed. The platforms were continuous benches, not separate beds. Bodies lay close together. A hand's width might separate sleepers in some positions, nothing at all in others. Children pressed against parents, siblings against each other. The proximity was total, every sound audible, every movement felt through the shared wooden surface, every breath adding to the moisture in the shared air. Privacy did not exist in this arrangement. What happened on the sleeping platforms happened within hearing of the entire household. Intimate moments between married couples, children's nightmares, the sounds of sickness, arguments conducted in fierce whispers, all of it shared. Privacy is a concept built on physical separation, on walls and doors and individual rooms. The Longhouse offered none of these things. Some wealthier households attempted partial solutions. Hanging textiles from the ceiling beams could create visual barriers around the high-seat sleeping area, giving the household head and his wife a measure of separation from the rest of the household. These fabric walls appear in saga descriptions occasionally. Costly wool hangings that demonstrated wealth while providing a degree of screening, but they blocked sight only not sound, and they were luxuries beyond most households' means. For the majority of people sleeping in longhouses, the community of the sleeping platform was absolute. The household existed as a unit in waking hours and remained a unit through the night. Individual isolation was neither possible nor, perhaps, desired. Safety came from numbers. Warmth came from clustering. The collective body of the household survived winter together, each person contributing their heat to the whole, each person's survival dependent on the group's endurance. The arrangement shifted slightly with seasons. In the coldest depths of winter, people packed more tightly, maximizing shared warmth. In autumn and early spring, when temperatures were less extreme, some spreading out might occur, though the fundamental positions remained stable. Visitors disrupted this geography temporarily. When travelers arrived seeking shelter, a common necessity in a landscape of scattered farmsteads and dangerous weather, they were given positions appropriate to their status. A person of high standing might be offered a place of honor near the high seat. A stranger of uncertain status might sleep near the door. The host's obligation to provide shelter was strong in Norse culture, encoded in social and religious expectations. But the sleeping platform had only so much space. Adding bodies meant compression, adjustment, a temporary reorganization that would return to normal once guests departed. The platforms ran the length of the longhouse in many designs, potentially offering space for a dozen people or more on each side. In a household with fewer members, the sleeping area might occupy only the central portion of the platforms, leaving the ends for storage or other purposes. In a household packed with family, servants, and thralls, every section might be occupied, bodies arranged from one end to the other. This geography of sleep was the geography of survival. Position determined warmth. Warmth determined comfort through the long dark. And comfort, or its absence, reinforced the social order every single night. The household head slept warm at the center. The thrall slept cold by the door. Between them, the household arranged itself according to ancient patterns of kinship, obligation, and power, the social structure made physical in the simple question of who slept where. Outside, the wind continues across frozen ground. Snow settles against the turf walls. Stars wheel slowly through the long dark. The landscape holds its winter silence, vast and indifferent and absolutely cold. But from the longhouse roof, smoke still rises, thin and pale against the night sky, carried upward by the warmth of the fire below, dispersing into air so cold it would kill an exposed person in hours. That line of smoke is evidence, proof of fire, proof of warmth held inside earth and timber, proof that human ingenuity found answers to the simple, brutal question: how do we sleep when the world outside wants us dead? The answers were not complicated. Earth walls thick enough to stop the wind, a fire fed carefully through the dark hours, wool from sheep bred over generations for their fleece, furs from animals hunted and processed, platforms that lifted bodies above the coldest air, and the warmth of other humans, pressed close, sharing the heat their bodies generated simply by being alive. Layer upon layer, material and method and the knowledge passed from one winter to the next, small solutions that together became survival. Inside, the household sleeps, children clustered near parents, the old given the warmest positions, the firekeeper waking when the flames burn too low, adding wood, letting the household's collective warmth continue, bodies arranged by status and kinship, in patterns so familiar that darkness cannot confuse them. This was not a single family's invention, not one clever builder's design. It was the accumulated learning of generations who lived where winter tested every weakness, who adapted and refined and passed down the methods that worked, year after year, winter after winter. The knowledge embedded in the longhouse form, in the layering of bedding, in the careful attention to every detail that contributed to warmth. The smoke rises, the household sleeps, and somewhere in the darkness, Another winter night passes, the cold held at bay by earth and fire and wool, and the patient determination to wake when morning comes. The platform held more than one person. This was not a matter of crowding, it was design. The sleeping arrangement along the raised benches placed people deliberately close, shoulder to shoulder, back to chest, legs overlapping beneath shared furs. A family of 6 or 8 occupied a platform that could have been built wider, spaced farther apart, divided into individual sections. But it was not. Body heat was a resource. Like firewood, like stored grain, it required management. An adult body at rest generated warmth continuously through the night. That warmth radiated outward into cold air, lost to darkness unless something or someone was there to receive it. Children slept between adults. A small child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, settled into the space between mother and father, wrapped in wool, but pulled close against the larger bodies on either side. The child's own heat was modest, but the heat from 2 adults converged around the small body, surrounding it. Held in place by the shared furs pulled over all 3. The placement was intentional. Children lost heat faster than adults, smaller bodies, thinner layers of fat, less mass to retain warmth through long hours. Alone, a child would wake cold before dawn. Between 2 adults, beneath sheepskin and wadmal, the child remained warm until morning. The same principle extended across the platform. An elderly member of the household, perhaps a grandmother whose own heat had diminished with age, occupied the position closest to the hearth. The warmest spot went to the person who needed it most. Younger adults who generated more heat and tolerated cold better slept farther from the fire. This was the geography of survival. Status mattered in the high seat position, in the allocation of drinking horns, in the order of speaking at gatherings. But at night, physiology overruled social hierarchy. The body that needed warmth most received the warmest position. When someone fell ill, the arrangement shifted. Fever, injury, or the particular exhaustion that came with sickness changed a person's ability to maintain warmth. A household member weakened by illness might be moved closer to the fire, given additional furs positioned between the 2 warmest sleepers. The collective resource of body heat redistributed itself around need. The sleeping platform held perhaps 8 people across its length. Each body radiated heat. Each body also absorbed heat from those nearby. The exchange was constant, invisible, automatic. Where bodies pressed close, warmth pooled. Where gaps opened, a restless sleeper turning away, a child shifting position, cold air infiltrated until the gap closed again. Furs and wool sealed the arrangement. A large bearskin, pulled across multiple sleepers, trapped the collective warmth beneath it. The air under that fur warmed from the combined heat of several bodies. Each person breathed warmed air, touched warmed fabric, lay against warmed wool. The heat one body produced became available to all bodies beneath the same covering. This was not comfort in the modern sense. Bodies touched constantly. Privacy did not exist. A person could not move without affecting those nearby. Rolling over meant disturbing the person pressed against your back. Stretching legs meant encountering someone else's feet. The shared fur shifted when anyone shifted. But the alternative was cold. A person sleeping alone, even with the same amount of wool and fur, lost heat steadily to the air around them. One body warming the space beneath a covering worked harder than 5 bodies warming the same space. The mathematics of heat loss favored the collective arrangement. Children understood this without explanation. They burrowed instinctively toward warmth, pressing against whoever lay nearest. Adults arranged themselves with practiced efficiency. No words needed to establish who slept where. The household had performed this arrangement every winter night for years. The collective extended beyond immediate family. A longhouse might shelter thralls, extended relatives, visiting craftsmen waiting out a storm. They found places on the platforms according to the same principles. Status determined proximity to the high seat position during the day. Need and heat production determined sleeping position at night. Even teenagers, old enough to generate significant body heat, young enough to tolerate cold reasonably well, occupied positions that served the household's thermal economy. They slept on the ends of the platform, nearest the doors, where cold penetrated most. Their stronger bodies formed a buffer between the cold exterior and the children, and elderly in warmer positions. Personal warmth became communal property. The heat your body produced did not belong only to you. It warmed the child beside you, the elderly person at your back, the sick household member who needed it more than you did. Your warmth and theirs, and the warmth from the fire, and the insulation of earth walls, and the barrier of wool and fur, all these combined into a system that kept everyone alive until morning. This was the exchange required by winter: individual comfort, individual space, individual control over your own warmth. These were warm weather luxuries. Winter required a different arrangement. Bodies served the collective. Heat was shared. Survival was communal. The sleeping platform held its occupants close through the dark hours. And when the coldest hour arrived, just before dawn, the shared warmth beneath the furs made the difference between sleep and shivering wakefulness. The fabric against your skin came from an animal bred specifically for cold. Scandinavian sheep were not the same as sheep raised in warmer regions. Generations of selective breeding had produced animals with dense, oily fleece, thick enough to protect the sheep themselves through the same winters. Their wool would eventually protect their human keepers. The wool these sheep produced was a material engineered by necessity. Lanolin saturated each fiber. This waxy substance, secreted by the sheep's skin, coated the wool with natural oils. When you touched raw fleece, your fingers came away slightly greasy. That grease was not removed during processing. It remained in the spun yarn, in the woven fabric, in the finished garment or blanket. The lanolin made the wool water-resistant. Snow landing on a wool cloak beaded on the surface rather than soaking through. Light rain did the same. Even when wool became damp, and it did become damp, in a longhouse where breath and bodies produce constant moisture, the lanolin-coated fibers retained their insulating properties. This was the critical difference. Plant fibers, linen from flax, lost their warmth when wet. Damp linen pulled heat away from skin, but damp wool still trapped air between its fibers, still created the dead air spaces that prevented heat loss. A person could sleep beneath wool that had absorbed moisture from breath and sweat and still remain warm. The textile was called vadmal, thick, dense fabric produced on the household's upright loom. The weaving created a tight structure where fibers interlocked, forming a barrier against wind and a trap for warmth. The finished fabric had weight and heft. A vadmal blanket was heavy enough that you felt it pressing down when pulled over you at night. That weight served a purpose. Heavy fabric draped over bodies without gaps, creating continuous coverage that prevented warm air from escaping. Light fabric might lift slightly with movement, allowing cold air underneath. Vadmal stayed in place. The labor required to produce this textile was enormous. Sheep required tending year-round. Feeding through winter, lambing in spring, summer grazing, autumn shearing. The fleece then required processing. Women cleaned it. Picking out debris and matted sections, they carded it to align the fibers. They spun it into yarn on drop spindles, a process that consumed hours upon hours of work. The spinning alone represented months of labor. A woman might spin while walking, while talking, while supervising children, the spindle dangling and turning as her fingers drew out the fibers. The motion was constant, repetitive, skilled. A household needed enough yarn to weave the fabric that would clothe and cover every person through winter. Then came the weaving. The warp threads, vertical on the loom, were tensioned with stone or clay weights. The weft threads, horizontal, passed over and under the warp in the pattern that created the fabric structure. Tablet weaving produced decorative trim, complex patterns formed by turning small square cards through which threads passed. Archaeological finds show the sophistication of this work. Textile fragments preserved in graves and bogs reveal tight, even weaves, patterns of stripes and checks, tablet-woven borders with intricate geometric designs. This was not crude or primitive fabric. It was the product of deep material knowledge and refined skill. The women who produced vadmal understood wool the way a smith understood iron. They knew how different fleeces behaved, which sheep produced the finest wool, which produced the strongest. They knew how tightly to spin for different purposes, how many threads per centimeter created fabric dense enough to block wind. They knew that washing finished vadmal in hot water and beating it caused the fibers to full, to compress and mat together into an even denser, warmer textile. This knowledge was not written down. It was demonstrated, practiced, corrected, and passed between generations of women working side by side. A girl learned to card wool by watching her mother, by trying and failing, and trying again until her hands understood the motion. She learned to spin by ruining yarn, creating lumpy, uneven thread until gradually her fingers found the consistent tension that produced usable results. The textile economy of the household depended on this labor. Without wool fabric, there were no warm clothes, no blankets, no sleeping covers. The family froze. Textile production was not decorative or optional. It was survival technology. The smell of wool was everywhere in the Longhouse. Raw fleece, cleaned fleece, spun yarn, woven fabric, worn clothing, all carried the distinctive lanolin scent. It mixed with smoke and bodies and cooking to form the particular smell of inhabited space in winter. The texture of wool was equally constant, rough against skin when newly woven. Softer with wear and washing, but never smooth like linen. The fibers had scales that gave them grip and texture. You felt that texture constantly, in your clothing, in your bedding, against your face when you pulled a cloak over your head against wind. But that texture meant warmth. The roughness was the physical structure that trapped air, that created insulation, that turned sheep's fleece into the material that made winter survival possible. Fur provided additional warmth, sheepskin with the wool still attached, pelts from hunted animals. But fur was finite. You could only acquire as many furs as you could trade for or hunt. Wool was renewable. Every year the sheep grew new fleece. Every year the household produced new textile. The loom, the spindle, the skill of women's hands. These converted renewable fleece into the layers that covered sleeping platforms and bodies. The platform's bedding rested on this foundation. Wadmal blankets formed the base layers. Woolen cloaks doubled as covers. Every textile in the stack came from the same source: Scandinavian sheep, household labor, material knowledge refined across generations. When you settled onto the sleeping platform and pulled the wool coverings over you, you wrapped yourself in technology as sophisticated as any produced in the medieval world. Technology designed for one purpose: to keep human bodies warm enough to survive the night. Clothing did not come off at night, not entirely. Not in the way a person living in a heated home might undress for bed. The Longhouse offered warmth, but it was not the consistent warmth that allows bare skin. It was fire warmth, conditional warmth, warmth that depended on proximity to the hearth, on the quality of furs piled above, on the body heat of those sleeping nearby. So clothing became part of the sleeping arrangement. Another layer, another barrier between flesh and cold. The base layer remained: linen undertunic and undertrousers for those who owned them, wool for those who didn't. These garments sat closest to skin, worn until they needed washing, absorbing sweat and body oil. They provided the first thin barrier. In summer, they might be all a person wore to sleep. In winter, they were only the beginning. Over this, the wool tunic stayed on. The trousers stayed on. These were the primary garments, the layers worn throughout the day. A person might loosen them, untie drawstrings at neck and waist, allow the fabric to sit less tightly. But removal was impractical. The cold pressed against the turf walls. The fire would burn lower through the night. Waking at midnight, or in the hours before dawn, meant emerging from whatever warmth that the sleeping platform offered. Clothing needed to already be in place. The thick wool cloak served double purpose. During the day it wrapped around shoulders, fastened with a pin or brooch, providing an outer shell against wind and snow. At night, it became a blanket. A person would lie down, still wearing inner layers, pull the cloak over themselves as covering, tuck it around legs and feet. The same garment that provided mobility in daytime became stationary insulation at night. This was not a sign of poverty or hardship specifically. It was simply the logic of limited warmth. Clothing functioned as portable shelter, a personal microclimate that moved with the body. To remove it meant surrendering that protection. In a space where ambient temperature rarely climbed far above freezing during deep winter, surrendering protection was wasteful. The number of garments available was limited. A person might own 2 sets of clothing, perhaps 3 if they had resources. 1 set worn, 1 set cleaned or mending, possibly a third for rotation. Clothing represented substantial labor: wool processing, spinning, weaving, cutting, sewing. Every garment took weeks or months to produce. They were maintained carefully, repaired repeatedly, worn until they could no longer function. So the same tunic a person wore to feed animals, to carry firewood, to prepare food, was the tunic they wore to sleep. The same trousers, the same leg wrappings wound around calves. The fabric became familiar, softened with wear, mapped to specific parts of the body. A patch on the left elbow, a seam that sat against the hip, the particular weight of wool that had been fulled and felted and worked into dense textile. The layers created bulk. A person dressed for winter sleep was larger than their summer self, wrapped in textile that added thickness to arms and legs and torso. This bulk became part of how bodies fit together on the sleeping platform. Children especially could burrow into the spaces between larger bodies, their own smaller forms layered in cut-down versions of adult clothing. Rough wool sat against skin. This was the texture of survival. Wool that had been processed enough to be functional, but not refined to softness. The lanolin had been partially washed out during cleaning, but enough remained to give the fabric slight oiliness, water resistance, a smell that mixed sheep and smoke and human use. The roughness was simply accepted. A person became accustomed to it, the slight scratch and prickle that meant warmth. Where fabric wore thin, cold found its way through. Elbows and knees, stressed by constant bending, developed weak spots. The lower edge of a tunic, dragging through daily work, frayed and thinned. These vulnerable points were patched when possible, reinforced with new fabric. When they couldn't be patched, they were positioned carefully during sleep, tucked under, covered by other layers, kept away from direct exposure to cold air. The waistline of trousers loosened at night, drawstrings untied enough to allow breathing to expand the belly. The neckline of the tunic opened, the gathering string released so fabric didn't bind the throat. These small adjustments provided comfort without sacrificing coverage. The clothing remained in place but became less restrictive, allowing the body to settle into sleep while staying protected. Some garments were designated for night use specifically. Older tunics too worn for daily labor but still functional for sleeping. Cloaks that had lost their pins and couldn't be fastened properly for outdoor wear but could still cover a body on the sleeping platform. These pieces occupied a category between useful and discarded, kept because winter demanded every available layer. The distinction between dressed and undressed blurred. There was no nightclothes as a separate category. There was only the spectrum of layers adjusted according to immediate need. Full outdoor dress when venturing out. Loosened indoor dress during daytime activity, maintained indoor dress during sleep. The body stayed contained within textile, the amount and tightness varying, but the basic principle remaining constant. This approach to sleep required accepting that clothing and bedding were not separate systems. They were integrated. The cloak that covered you was the cloak you wore. The tunic that warmed you at night was the tunic you worked in tomorrow. Everything served multiple purposes. Nothing was specialized. The economy of survival did not allow for single-function items. The head lost heat fastest. This was understood without scientific terminology. A person could feel it. Step outside in winter with an uncovered head, even while the body stayed wrapped in wool and fur, and cold struck first at the scalp, the ears, the back of the neck. Warmth bled upward and disappeared into frozen air. So heads were covered at night. Wool caps, simple in construction, were worn to sleep. These were not decorative items. They were close-fitting, covering the crown and ears completely, often extending down to the nape. Some were sewn from a single piece of fulled wool, shaped to the skull. Others were constructed from triangular panels, joined at the top with flat seams that wouldn't create uncomfortable ridges against a wooden headrest or bundled cloak used as pillow. Children wore caps constantly during winter, indoors and out. Adults might remove them during the warmest part of the day if the fire was built high, but replace them as evening came and the longhouse cooled. By the time bodies settled onto sleeping platforms, caps were back in place. They stayed on through the night. The cap covered ears entirely. Ears, exposed and thin-fleshed, suffered quickly in cold. Frostbite found them easily. A cap that didn't protect ears was not fulfilling its function. The wool needed to extend fully over and around them, trapping warmth close to the skull and preventing the ache that came from cold, penetrating cartilage. For those with longer hair, the hair itself provided some insulation, but not enough. Women's hair, worn long and often braided, was arranged under or around the cap. Braids could be wrapped around the head, adding bulk, then covered with the cap over top. Men's hair, varying in length depending on personal preference and regional custom, was similarly contained. Hair alone was insufficient. The textile layer was necessary. Beards, common among adult men, offered slight protection to the lower face and neck, but they also collected moisture from breathing, which could freeze at the tips when exposed to severe cold. Inside the longhouse, this was less of a concern, but it reinforced the value of keeping the head and neck covered and warm. Feet presented a different challenge. They rested at the end of circulation, farthest from the heart, receiving less blood flow. They pressed against whatever surface they touched, wooden platforms, straw bedding, the floor if a person rose in the night. They were vulnerable. Wool leg wrappings were the primary foot protection. These long strips of wool fabric wound around the lower leg from ankle to knee, held in place by the wrapping tension itself or by ties. During the day, they provided support and warmth. At night, they could remain wound, keeping feet and ankles insulated. Some sleepers loosened boots but did not remove them. Leather footwear, worn with straw or wool stuffed inside for additional insulation, could be unlaced enough to relieve pressure, but left in place to maintain warmth. The boots became part of the sleeping arrangement, functional rather than comfortable. Others removed boots but immediately wrapped feet in additional wool layers. Spare fabric, worn sections of old garments, dedicated foot wrappings. The feet needed containment. Left bare, even under furs, they would grow cold. Toes especially, with their thin flesh and small surface area, suffered when exposed. The sleeper lying down pulled knees toward chest, feet tucked up, minimizing the length of body that extended toward the colder end of the platform. This curled position, common across cold climates, reduced exposed surface area and brought feet closer to the core warmth of the torso. Hands could be tucked into clothing folds. The tunic hung loose enough to allow hands to withdraw inside, pulling arms partway out of sleeves and crossing hands over chest or stomach, protected by the wool layer. Alternatively, hands could be tucked into armpits, the warmest accessible location, or slipped into the waistband of trousers, where body heat collected. Fingers went numb quickly when exposed. They needed conscious positioning. Children were taught to tuck hands properly before sleep, to keep them protected through the night. A child waking with painfully cold hands had forgotten the lesson. The face remained exposed by necessity. Breathing required open-air access. But even here, a sleeper might pull the edge of a cloak or fur up near the face, creating a pocket of warmer air around nose and mouth. Breath itself added moisture to this small space, and moisture held heat better than dry air. The dampness was tolerated because the warmth was necessary. The neck, where major blood vessels ran close to the surface, received particular attention. A hood attached to a cloak could be drawn up over the head and around the neck. Failing that, a separate wool scarf or strip of fabric could be wrapped loosely around the throat. This area could not be allowed to cool significantly. Every protruding part, every thin-fleshed extremity, every point where blood flowed close to skin, these were vulnerabilities. Cold found them. The body's core might be warm, wrapped in layers and covered in furs, but if ears or toes or fingers were left exposed, pain interrupted sleep. Frostbite remained a real danger, even inside a structure if extremities went unprotected through a long winter night when fires burned low. The attention paid to these details reflected accumulated knowledge. Generations of winter sleepers had learned where the body lost heat, what happened when protection was insufficient, which coverings worked and which didn't. This knowledge was transmitted practically, a parent adjusting a child's cap, wrapping their feet more securely, showing them how to tuck hands properly. The same adjustments made on oneself, repeated every night until they became automatic. There was no piece of the body too small to matter. A cold ear kept a person awake. Numb toes ached. The discomfort radiated, making sleep difficult even when the core body remained warm. Comfort was not luxury. Comfort meant warmth maintained at every point, allowing the body to rest rather than fight cold through the dark hours. The morning brought reassessment, feet unwrapped or boots relaced, caps remaining in place until the fire was built high and the interior warmed. Fingers flexed to restore circulation. Each extremity returned to function, proven by another night to have been adequately protected. The final layer mattered most. Beneath it all, beneath the wooden platform, the heather bedding, the straw, the wadmal blankets, lay a foundation anyone could build. The warmth came from structure, from layering, from the physics of trapped air and woven wool. But the top layer was different. What you pulled over yourself in the coldest hours, what touched your skin, what weight pressed down and held the warmth close. This announced who you were. This came from animals hunted or traded, from networks of exchange that stretched across Scandinavia and beyond, from wealth accumulated or status inherited. Sheepskin was common. Nearly every household kept sheep. The hides came as a byproduct of necessity, from animals slaughtered for meat or culled from flocks before winter feeding became unsustainable. The wool stayed attached to the leather. The lanolin remained in the fibers. A good sheepskin made a soft, warm covering. It was thick enough to matter, common enough to acquire, practical enough to use daily. Most people slept under sheepskin, but not everyone. Reindeer hides came from the north, from Sami herders and hunters who knew the migrations, who followed the animals across tundra and brought back what farming communities could not produce themselves. Reindeer fur was denser than sheep, built for Arctic cold, lighter in weight but remarkable in warmth. A reindeer hide marked access to trade routes, relationships with northern peoples, resources beyond what a single farmstead could generate. Seal fur came from coastal regions. Families living near the sea hunted seals for meat and oil, but the pelt served a specific purpose in sleeping arrangements. Seal fur was sleek and water-resistant. It shed moisture rather than absorbing it. Useful in the damp cold of maritime winters. The fur was dark, dense, distinctive. It marked a household connected to the coast, to ocean resources, to a different survival strategy than inland farmers employed. Bear fur was rare. A bearskin was heavy, thick, almost excessive in its warmth. Hunting bear was dangerous. The pelts came from individuals willing to take significant risk, or from trade with those who specialized in such hunts. A bear fur might cover the sleeping space of a household head, marking not just wealth but the kind of courage and capability that justified social leadership. The fur was coarse, the hide substantial. When pulled, Over a sleeper, it created a microclimate of its own, a pocket of warmth so complete that even the coldest night could be endured. Wolf fur carried different meaning. Wolves were competitors, predators that threatened livestock through winter months when food scarcity made them bold. A wolf pelt represented elimination of threat as much as acquisition of warmth. The fur was long, thick, silver gray, or dark. It was soft in texture, despite coming from a creature built for endurance and hunting. Wolf furs appeared in higher status sleeping spaces, valued both for practical warmth and for the statement they made about a household's ability to defend its resources. In Iceland, Arctic fox became available, small pelts, white or blue-gray, dense beyond measure. Multiple fox furs might be sewn together to create a larger covering. The effort required to assemble such a blanket made it valuable. The warmth it provided made it coveted. The hierarchy was visible in the sleeping arrangement. The household head, sleeping in the position of honor, claimed the best furs. A bear hide might cover his sleeping space. His wife beside him shared in that warmth, her position granting access to resources that defined the household's prosperity. Children sleeping nearby might have reindeer hides or fine sheepskins. Thralls and lower-status household members may do with older sheepskins, more worn, less soft, functional but unmistakably different from what covered their social superiors. This arrangement was not cruel. It was practical hierarchy made visible through material culture. When illness struck, the rules shifted. A sick child or household member received the warmest furs regardless of normal status. The best hides moved to wherever they were most needed for survival. This flexibility existed within the framework of status, not in opposition to it. The furs returned to their usual positions when health returned. Acquisition happened through multiple channels. Some furs came from animals hunted directly, the sheep raised on the farm, the seal taken from nearby waters, the occasional bear or wolf killed when opportunity and necessity aligned. Other furs entered the household through trade. A successful harvest might be exchanged for a reindeer hide from the north. Surplus goods carried to market could return as a wolf pelt purchased from professional hunters. Marriage brought furs as part of a bride's dowry, adding to household resources and sleeping comfort. Status accumulated slowly, one fur at a time, over years and generations. The texture mattered as much as the warmth. Sheepskin felt familiar, wool soft, similar to the blankets beneath it. Reindeer fur was finer, almost delicate despite its warmth. Bear fur was rough, substantial, heavy enough to feel like armor against the cold. Seal fur was sleek, cool to first touch, then warming quickly from body heat trapped beneath it. Wolf fur was long enough to tangle fingers in, soft enough to stroke while falling asleep. By midwinter, when cold reached its deepest point, every fur in the household was in use. Nothing remained stored or saved. The hierarchy remained visible, but the practical need unified everyone under whatever covering they possessed. The household head under his bear hide and the thrall under worn sheepskin were both seeking the same thing: enough warmth to reach morning. The furs would last for years if cared for properly. They were shaken out, aired when possible, repaired when seams split or edges wore thin. A good fur might serve a generation, then pass to the next. Its presence in the household a continuity of warmth and status across decades. Winter changed time itself. At the solstice in southern Scandinavia, daylight lasted roughly 6 hours. The sun rose late, stayed low, set early. The light never reached full brightness, remaining dim and slanted even at midday. Shadows stretched long across snow. The transition from day to night was brief, more a deepening of existing dimness than a dramatic change. In northern Norway, the sun did not rise at all. For weeks, polar night settled over the landscape. Twilight came at midday, a pale glow on the southern horizon that never strengthened into dawn. The rest was darkness, 18-20 hours of unbroken night. The world existed in firelight and starlight, in moon glow reflected off snow, in the subtle differences between deep black and charcoal gray that marked the passing hours. In this darkness, sleep followed different rules. There was no reason to anchor rest to a sun that barely appeared or never rose. The body's rhythms, freed from the tyranny of daylight schedules, found their own pattern. Sleep came in segments, separated by waking hours that served purposes daylight would have filled in other seasons. First sleep began after the evening meal, after the last tasks were completed and the fire banked for the long night. Families settled onto their platforms, pulled furs close, and let exhaustion carry them into unconsciousness. This sleep was deep, the heavy rest that came from physical labor and the body's need to conserve energy in extreme cold. It lasted 4, perhaps 5 hours. Then came waking, not the waking of morning, but something else, a natural surfacing into consciousness in the middle of darkness, unplanned, but expected. One person would stir, then another, eyes open to see the same darkness that had been present when sleep began. The fire had burned down to embers. The cold had crept closer to the sleeping platforms. The night was perhaps half finished. This was not restless insomnia. It was simply how sleep worked when darkness stretched so long that the body could not remain unconscious for its entire duration. Someone rose to tend the fire. This task fell to whoever woke most fully, felt most capable of leaving the warmth of furs for the cold air beyond the sleeping platform. They moved carefully through the darkness, feet finding familiar paths across the floor. Wood was added to the embers. The fire rebuilt itself slowly, flames licking up from coals that had stayed alive through the first sleep. Firelight pushed back the darkness, filling the longhouse with moving shadows and warm illumination. The space transformed from invisible to visible, familiar shapes emerging from black. Others remained on the sleeping platforms but sat up, pulling furs around shoulders, watching the fire return to life. The household was awake, but not active, present, but not working. This was the between time, the hours that belonged neither to day nor to sleep, but to the long northern night itself. Quiet work happened in this time, handwork that required some light, but not much. Spinning, preparing materials for weaving, carving, mending tools, braiding rope. The work was portable, brought to the sleeping platform, or done while seated near the fire. Hands stayed busy while the body remained warm. Production continued even in winter's deepest darkness, using hours that would otherwise pass unused. Stories were told in this time. The sagas that preserved history and legend, the genealogies that connected present families to distant ancestors, the poems that captured the values and wisdom of the culture. These found their audience in the wakeful darkness. Voices carried clearly in the quiet longhouse. The fire provided focus. There was nothing to do but listen, remember, pass along what had been passed down. Children learned in this darkness. They heard the stories that would shape their understanding of who they were and where they came from. They watched the handwork that they would later perform themselves. They absorbed the rhythm of long winter nights, the patience required to endure darkness without anxiety, the productive use of time that seemed empty but was full of its own purpose. The wakeful period lasted an hour, sometimes 2. Then gradually sleep returned. The fire burned steadily now, no longer needing immediate attention. The handwork was set aside. The stories reached their endpoints or natural pauses. One by one, household members lay back down, pulled furs close again, and let second sleep arrive. This sleep was different from the first. It was lighter, more prone to dreams, more easily broken by sounds or discomfort. But it carried the household through the remaining darkness, through the coldest hours before any hint of dawn, through the time when night felt most endless and morning most distant. And second sleep ended with true waking, with the necessity of beginning the day regardless of whether light had returned. In midwinter the day began in darkness because darkness was all there was. The fire was built up fully. Morning tasks commenced. The rhythm of activity resumed, constrained by lack of light, but not stopped by it. This pattern, first sleep, waking, second sleep, morning, was not universal or rigid. Some nights, exhaustion kept sleepers unconscious from evening until morning. Some nights, cold or hunger or worry prevented deep sleep entirely. But the general rhythm existed, documented in pre-industrial societies across northern latitudes, a natural response to darkness that lasted far longer than the body's capacity for continuous sleep. The Longhouse accommodated this rhythm. Its design assumed people would be awake at various hours, that the fire would need tending throughout the night, that activity would not cease completely just because the sun had set. The sleeping platforms allowed people to rest while others moved about. The central hearth provided a focus for wakeful hours. The space worked equally well for sleep and for the quiet work that filled the between time. Year after year, winter after winter, families found their way through the long darkness using this rhythm, not fighting against it, not treating it as abnormal, but accepting it as the pattern that fit the season. Sleep when the body demanded it. Wake when consciousness surfaced naturally. Use the wakeful hours productively. Return to sleep when it came again. The darkness was not an enemy to be conquered. It was simply the condition of winter, as normal as cold, as expected as snow. The rhythm of sleep adapted to it, found its shape within it, and made the long nights endurable. The night did not pass in one unbroken arc of unconsciousness. Winter darkness stretched 14, 16, sometimes 18 hours across Scandinavia. To sleep through that entire span was neither practical nor, for many, natural. The pattern that emerged, documented in saga references and supported by broader medieval European sleep research, divided the night into two distinct periods. First sleep, a wakeful interval. Second sleep. This was not restless insomnia. It was structured rest, adapted to extreme seasonal darkness. The wakeful period arrived sometime after midnight. A person would surface from first sleep, not to crisis or cold, but to a particular quality of quiet alertness. The fire had burned down to coals. The longhouse had cooled slightly. Others still slept on the platforms, their breathing steady in the darkness. This was when someone rose to tend the fire. The task required leaving the warmth of furs and blankets. Feet found the earthen floor. Cold air met skin. But the work was brief and familiar. A person crouched beside the hearth, stirred the coals with an iron poker, added split wood from the stack kept dry inside. Flames caught. Heat began rebuilding. Within minutes, the fire crackled again, pushing warmth back into the smoky air. With the fire restored, the wakeful person faced a choice: return immediately to the sleeping platform, or remain awake. Many chose to remain. The interval between sleeps offered something the rest of the day did not: solitude within the communal space, and usable time during otherwise empty hours. The darkness that made outdoor work impossible created indoor opportunity. By firelight, handwork continued. A woman might take up her spindle, drawing wool into thread with practiced motions that required no bright light. The rhythmic twist of fiber, the growing length of yarn. This work filled storage chests through winter and could proceed in near darkness. Some nights brought weaving at a small frame loom, fingers finding the familiar pattern of threads. Men maintained tools. A knife needed sharpening. A wooden bowl had cracked and wanted repair. An axe handle required smoothing. Leather straps could be oiled, seams checked, buckles adjusted. These tasks filled the quiet hours and ensured that when spring came, equipment was ready. In some households, this became the time for working with bone or antler, carving toggles, making needles, shaping combs from horn. The materials were hard enough to require attention, but forgiving enough to work by uncertain light. Small functional objects emerged from these night hours, practical items that smoothed daily life. Livestock sometimes needed checking. In longhouses with attached byres separated from human sleeping space by wooden partitions, animals required occasional attention through the night. A cow might be laboring with a difficult birth. A sheep could tangle itself in tethers. The sounds from the animal quarters, shifting hooves, low breathing, the occasional bleat, carried through the partition, and an experienced farmer learned which sounds meant rest and which required intervention. The trip into the byre meant crossing through cold air, but the animal quarters held their own warmth. Cattle and sheep generated heat. Their bodies, like human bodies, radiated warmth that collected in the enclosed space. A person checking on livestock entered a different climate. The smell of animals strong, the air thick, the darkness nearly total, except for whatever lamp or emberlit stick provided light. After checking that all was well, return to the hall. Some nights, this wakeful period became social. If more than one person surfaced from first sleep, conversation happened. Low voices by firelight. The exchange was not animated or loud. Others still slept nearby, but it created space for talk that the busy daylight hours compressed. Questions about spring planting, concerns about food stores, memories of previous winters. The quiet processing of daily life. Stories emerged in these hours. Sagas and family histories passed through generations, not only in formal recitation, but in these nighttime fragments. An older household member might begin recounting an event from years past. Others might add details, correct the sequence, debate what happened. The collective memory of the family maintained itself through these dark conversations. History preserved in the space between sleeps. Children sometimes woke during this interval. They would lie quiet on the sleeping platforms, listening to adult voices, absorbing stories and information that shaped their understanding of lineage and place. What they learned in these hours, half awake, warm beneath furs, hearing the calm voices of parents and grandparents, became foundational knowledge. Eventually, drowsiness returned. The fire burned steady. Tasks reached a stopping point. Conversation faded. One by one, people returned to the sleeping platforms, arranged themselves back into the warmth of blankets and furs, and let second sleep arrive. This portion of rest often carried them through to dawn. The longhouse was never silent. Even when all slept, sound filled the darkness. Layers of it. Some constant, some intermittent, some so familiar they vanished into background awareness, noticed only when they stopped. The fire spoke continuously, crackling, popping, the hiss of moisture escaping wood. Flames moved across logs with a sound like wind through grass, and when a piece of wood split from heat, the crack was sharp enough to wake a light sleeper. Coals settled with soft collapses, sending small showers of sparks upward into smoke. This sound anchored the night. As long as fire crackled, warmth persisted, breathing layered over the fire's voice. 10, 12, 15 people slept along the platforms. Each sleeper contributed their own rhythm. Some breathed deep and slow, others quick and shallow. Children made small sleeping sounds, murmurs, shifts in position, the occasional unintelligible word spoken into dreams. An elderly person might snore, a rough, steady sound that blended into the night's texture. The collective breathing created a presence. It confirmed life continuing through darkness. Livestock added their own sounds from the attached byre. Cows shifted weight, hooves scraping against earthen floor. The sound of chewing continued through the night as animals worked through hay or re-chewed their cud. A sheep might bleat softly. Rhythmic breathing of large animals, audible through the wooden partition, merged with human breath into one complex pattern of life sustained through winter. The building itself made noise. Timber beams contracted in cold, expanding slightly when fire warmed them, the movement producing creaks and groans. The turf roof settled under its own weight, and the weight of snow. Sometimes snow slid from the roof peak with a muffled rush, landing in heavy collapse on the ground outside. Wind found gaps in construction, producing low whistles or moans depending on its angle and strength. Outside, the winter landscape contributed sound or withheld it depending on conditions. Snow muffled everything. When fresh snow covered the ground deep, the world outside became almost preternaturally quiet. Wind moved without the friction of grass or leaves. Footsteps, if anyone walked, made soft compression sounds. The acoustic effect was profound. Sound seemed to stop at the longhouse walls, absorbed by snow and turf before it could travel. But wind could roar. Winter storms drove across Scandinavia with force that pressed against walls and roof. Gusts hit the longhouse in waves, each one creating a pressure that the turf walls absorbed and the timber frame resisted. The sound was immense, not quite the whistle of wind through trees, but a deeper rushing that filled hearing and made the interior feel paradoxically more protected and more vulnerable at once. Ice sometimes spoke. On nights when temperature fluctuated, ice forming on the roof or in cracks made sharp reports as it expanded. Lakes and rivers froze with sounds like cracking timber, carrying across frozen landscape as the ice sheet adjusted to temperature and pressure. Inside, small human sounds punctuated the night. Someone turning in sleep, furs rustling. The clink of a metal buckle against wood, a child coughing. The scrape of a wooden cup against stone as someone rose to drink water from the supply kept near the fire. When a person woke to tend the fire, their movements added new sounds. Feet on floor, the clatter of wood added to the hearth, the scrape of an iron poker through coals. These sounds were purposeful and brief, then subsided back into the layered quiet. Darkness amplified sound. Without visual input, ears sharpened. A sound that would go unnoticed in daylight became distinct at night. The exact pattern of each sleeper's breathing grew familiar. The difference between wind against the north wall versus the south wall became recognizable. The specific creak of one roof beam versus another entered awareness. For someone lying awake, these sounds created a map of the night. Fire still burning. Warmth continues. Livestock settled. Animals are well. Wind steady, but not violent. The storm is not worsening. Family breathing. Everyone still here. The soundscape provided information and reassurance. Sometimes the night brought sounds that required response. A child's cry, an animal in distress. The change in fire sound that meant it needed feeding. These sounds triggered waking, movement, action. But most sounds simply existed. The acoustic environment of survival, constant through the months of darkness. When morning came, the soundscape shifted. Voices replaced breathing. Movement became purposeful rather than the unconscious shifts of sleep. The fire was built up with deliberate effort, louder and more active. The partition to the animal quarters opened, bringing livestock sounds into the main hall. But through the long hours of winter night, sound filled the darkness with presence. Not silence, but the particular music of a household enduring cold together. Each sound evidence that life continued, that warmth persisted, that another night was passing as countless nights had passed before. In some longhouses, a partition divided the hall. On one side, the family. On the other, livestock. Not every farmstead followed this pattern, but in Iceland and marginal farming regions, animals and humans sheltered under the same roof through winter. The partition was practical. Wooden posts, woven branches, sometimes a wall of stacked turf. It blocked direct contact but allowed warmth to pass through. Cows, sheep, goats, their bodies generated heat continuously. That heat radiated into the human quarters, raising the overall temperature of the structure by degrees that mattered when wind cut across frozen ground outside. The sounds carried through. Breathing, shifting weight. The rhythmic movement of animals settling into their own sleep. A cow's low sound in darkness. the rustle of sheep in straw bedding. These noises became part of the night soundscape, familiar as the crackle of fire or the breathing of family members. The smell was constant. Wool and bodies in close quarters already created their own atmosphere. Animal presence added layers: hay, manure, the warm scent of livestock. This was not considered unpleasant. It was ordinary, the smell of survival. During wakeful periods between sleeps, someone might check the animals. A brief passage through the partition to ensure they had not tangled themselves, that nothing had gone wrong in darkness. Then back to the human side, to the fire, to the furs. The pre-dawn hours were the coldest. Fires burned low. Through the long night, the hearth consumed its fuel, flames reducing to embers, embers settling into beds of ash that held residual heat but cast almost no light. Cold crept inward during these hours. It came through the turf walls, through gaps around doors, down from the smoke hole in the roof. The heat generated by bodies and animals and the stone-lined hearth fought back, but the balance shifted toward cold as the fire weakened. Sleepers responded without waking fully, pulling furs tighter, shifting closer to the person beside them, burrowing deeper into the layered bedding until only the top of the head remained exposed to the cooling air. Someone had to wake first. Someone had to leave the warmth of furs and wool, swing bare or wrap feet to the wooden platform, then down to the floor where cold air pooled. That person crossed the dim space to the hearth, while others remained motionless in their sleeping nests. Feeding the fire in darkness required no light beyond the glow of embers. Add wood, wait for it to catch. The flames rose again, pushing warmth outward, and the coldest hours passed, and the fire was rebuilt before full waking. Someone rose first, not dramatically, but with the quiet practicality of routine repeated through countless winter mornings. They moved from the warmth of furs into cold air, felt for the hearth in darkness, and coaxed flame from embers that had burned through the night. Smoke thickened as the fire grew. It filled the upper space of the longhouse, heavy and acrid, before finding its way through roof vents. The person tending the fire stayed low, where the air was clearer, and added wood in careful measure. The cold was immediate outside the sleeping platform. Morning air settled near the floor, sharper than the smoky warmth higher up. This temperature boundary was crossed every morning. It was felt each time. Others woke gradually, not to light. Winter dawn came late, if it came at all, but to the sound of crackling wood, the movement of the first person up, the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere as fire changed the air. There was reluctance in this waking. Norse poetry from later centuries referenced it directly. The difficulty of leaving warm bedding, the weight of cold morning, the battle between comfort and necessity. This was not laziness. It was the body's rational response to genuine cold. But tasks required movement. Snow needed gathering for water. Food stores required checking. Animals needed tending. Firewood had to be brought inside before the next night. The frozen world outside demanded engagement, regardless of preference. The longhouse in mourning was a space of transition. Warm sleeping nests still held heat. The rebuilt fire offered a gathering point. But the day's work waited in the cold beyond the door. One by one, people left the platforms, pulled on additional layers, and prepared to meet the winter landscape. This happened every morning, through the darkest months, through storms, through the deep cold of midwinter. The routine did not change because it could not change. Survival required it. Winter sleeping arrangements were not permanent. They were one part of a cycle that turned through the full year. Summer brought different patterns. The longhouse remained the sleeping place, but the platform served other purposes during long daylight hours: sitting, working, storage. People spent more time outside. The fire burned smaller, or not at all, on the warmest nights. Autumn determined winter. The preparation done in those months, firewood gathered, food stored, wool processed, repairs completed, defined whether the family would sleep warm or cold, whether they would wake hungry or fed. Every autumn task was an investment in winter survival. Spring brought relief, but also danger. This was the hungry time when stored food ran lowest and new growth had not yet arrived. Late winter and early spring tested the household's rationing discipline. Sleep in these months carried a different weight than midwinter sleep. Not the depth of seasonal rest, but the lighter sleep of bodies, conserving energy against scarcity. The sleeping platforms witnessed this entire cycle. They marked the passage of seasons through the quality of rest they offered, the number of furs required, the ease or difficulty of morning waking. Success was measured simply: survival through to spring, livestock alive, food stores sufficient, family intact. The longhouse that kept people warm through winter darkness earned its place through function, not sentiment. Seasonal patience defined this life. Endurance was not dramatic. It was the quiet discipline of fuel rationing, of daily tasks repeated, of sleep taken in darkness and waking to more darkness, through weeks and months until gradually the light returned. The longhouse from outside still showed only that line of smoke rising into cold air. Inside, the cycle continued. Sleep, waking, work, sleep, season after season, generation after generation. The specific architecture of survival, built from earth and timber and the knowledge of cold. Outside, the wind moves across frozen ground. Smoke rises from the turf roof in a thin line, visible against the stars. Inside, the fire burns low. Bodies rest beneath wool and fur. The longhouse holds warmth through another winter night. This was not dramatic survival. It was architecture shaped by cold. Walls built from earth, platforms raised above stone floors, fires tended through darkness, wool layered over skin. Generation after generation, families slept this way. They understood what kept them warm. The smoke continues to rise. Morning is still hours away.